The editor here. I'm just here to make some things clear. Some relevant game footage will be in the back of this video, so it isn't just us talking over a black screen, and all sources relevant to their application will appear in the top left corner. I'm also sick, so if any of the parts I'm doing sound like I'm drowning, that's why. To truly understand the conflict that is the Russo-Ukrainian War, we need to understand the early 20th century Cold War and contemporary politics behind it, along with its motives, supporters, and also the current state of the conflict. And of course, the solution we come up with for a topic as complicated as this is not definitive. It is influenced by the current geopolitical stances of Canada and the world, and it could be the wrong choice mere days from now as the conflict continues to develop. Let us fulfill the obligations of making a social project by looking at the contention of liberalism and its values, the presence of illiberal parties in the conflict, and the Cold War's relation to the conflict, along with everything else in the rubric. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Ukraine and Russia adopted significantly different political paths. Ukraine began moving towards a system that incorporated liberal democratic elements such as competitive elections and increased political pluralism. This process was neither smooth nor universally supported, but it was shaped by moments of mass political mobilization. One of these moments was the Orange Revolution in 2004, which occurred after allegations of electoral fraud during a presidential election. These large protests emerged in response, leading to a rerun of the vote. The event did not resolve the Ukraine's long-term political challenges, but it demonstrated that segments of the population were willing to engage in civic action to influence governance. A similar pattern emerged during the Euromaidan protests of 2013 to 2014, after the Ukrainian government suspended plans to sign an association agreement with the European Union. What started as pro-EU demonstration expanded into broader protests against corruption and centralized power. These events contributed to a change in government and further strained relationships with Russia, which viewed the movement as a threat to its regional influence. Overall, by the time of the Ukrainian invasion, Ukraine reflected the values of classical liberalism within the country, being shaped similarly to other contemporary European nations. Russia's post-Soviet trajectory differed substantially. Political authority became increasingly centralized with a stronger emphasis on national stability, security, and state control. Over time, media independence declined, political opposition weakened, and dissent was more closely regulated. By the time of the current conflict, Russia features a centralized authoritarian government that leans heavily on illiberal practices like media censorship, voter manipulation, and removal of political adversaries in order to preserve the current powers. A significant portion of the reasoning used to justify the conflict can be tracked back to the Cold War era. Because both modern Russia and Ukraine were a part of the Soviet Union, they share historical ties in industry, infrastructure, and cultural development. During this period, political and economic systems were deliberately standardized across the USSR, reducing regional autonomy and reinforcing the idea of a unified Soviet space. As a result of this historical homogenization, Russian leadership has framed the war as not an invasion of a fully sovereign state, but as a reclamation of territory that was previously integrated into the Soviet system. This perspective reflects a Cold War worldview in which political legitimacy was tied to historical control and spheres of influence rather than contemporary self-determination. However, this interpretation conflicts with post-Cold War international norms, which recognize former Soviet republics as independent states with the right to define their own political and economic futures.
Ukraine's refusal to submit to Russian influence is at its core an assertion of liberal values: the right to self-determination, the right to choose its own alliances, and the right to maintain a democratic system free from external domination and pressure. Russia's actions represent quite the opposite. The invasion attempts to overthrow a democratically elected government through force, violating Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own political future. Inside of Russia, censorship, propaganda, and suppression of opposition reveal how illiberal state restrict freedoms to maintain control. The contrast between the two countries highlights why the conflict is often described as a clash between liberal democracies and authoritarianism. International responses reinforce the strength of liberal alliances. Western democracies have coordinated sanctions, humanitarian aid, and military support for Ukraine. While liberal states don't always act collectively, the invasion has shown that shared values can unite countries when fundamental rights are being threatened. Ukraine's resistance has become a symbol of liberal ideals such as sovereignty, democracy, and the right of citizens to shape their own destiny. The war has also shown how powerful citizenship and activism can be. Millions of Ukrainians have taken on active roles such as volunteering, donating supplies, joining territorial defense units, and supporting displaced families. This widespread participation of citizens has strengthened national unity and demonstrated how democratic values can be defended by just ordinary citizens. Around the world, protests in support of Ukraine have taken place in hundreds of cities such as Berlin, Paris, Rome, London, Madrid, and many more. These demonstrations have pressured governments around the world to increase their aid, impose sanctions on Russia, and condemn Russia's actions. This shows how civil society and not just political leaders can also help shape global response. Inside Russia, dissent is treated very differently. Anti-war protesters face arrest, censorship, and exile. Independent journalists have been silenced or forced to flee. This suppression of basic rights show how illiberal governments maintain power by limiting the freedom of expression and punishing political opposition. Digital activism has also played a major role. Ukrainians and human rights organizations have sued social media to document war crimes, counter disinformation, and mobilize international support. These efforts have kept global attention on the conflict and helped shape international policy regarding it.
To very briefly summarize the Ukrainian conflict and its current status, we need to go back to 2014. This is when the conflict officially began, as Russia captured the Crimean Peninsula from Ukraine. Unfortunately for Ukraine, much of the world refused to pay attention to the conflict, and very little aid was sent to assist Ukraine. This, paired with very low morale among Ukrainian soldiers, meant Crimea was taken very quickly, with overwhelming force. By the time of 2022, the conflict had officially been going on for 8 years. However, this would mark a significant point in the conflict, as Russia planned to fully invade the country. The reasoning behind this is still up to debate, but the most agreed upon reason is that Russia wanted to form a buffer state from NATO expansion towards their borders. Russia had feared that Ukraine might join NATO, and they were beginning to make plans to. However, Ukraine's internal policy instability and ongoing conflict initially prevented NATO membership. The conflict itself was meant to take 3 days. It's now nearly 4 years into the conflict, and no end is in clear sight. Many nations have helped Ukraine in fighting and continue to supply aid today. As the borders stand right now, Ukraine has regained much of the territory claimed in the first days of the invasion, as much of the Russian territory lies past the Dnipro River, a river nearing the pre-2022 borders. In some northern regions, Ukraine has even pushed forces back to the Ukrainian border, allowing these forces to strike into Russian territory, attacking military installations and fuel depots. Unfortunately, gains have been lessening as of recent, as Russian forces now feature complex multi-tiered fortifications that have halted the advance of Ukrainian forces, allowing Russia to maintain its hold over eastern parts of Ukraine. To begin forming possible ways to resolve the Ukrainian conflict, let's look at previous policies which hold relevance to the Ukrainian conflict. These are Cold War containment and the Marshall Plan. Containment was a strategy developed by both classical and modern liberal Western countries to limit the expansion of Soviet influence without engaging in direct military conflict. Rather than attempting to dismantle the Soviet Union, containment focused on strengthening surrounding states politically, economically, and militarily so that authoritarian influence would not spread further. Within the Cold War, this system functioned well, convincing many countries to adopt more Western values and leading many countries to resist the spread of communist ideology. However, it increased tensions among global superpowers and resulted in increased militarization along with further political polarization. To ensure an improved containment system today, the policy would need to shift from an escalatory use of deterrence to supplying a nation's own army with defenses. This would mean supplying a nation with defensive measures without the use of one's own forces, or offensive equipment like what we see today with Cold War containment. This wouldn't threaten a targeted nation or its allegiance, whether neutral or allied. Rather, it would clearly focus on de-escalation and long-term war prevention, which also allows for more diplomatic options within a conflict. In the context of Ukraine, modern military aid, intelligence sharing, and NATO support can be interpreted as a contemporary form of containment. Additionally, the war in Ukraine has influenced many neutral nations to join the NATO alliance, further contributing to contemporary containment of Russian expansion and interests, yet harming cooperation between the world and Russia. The Marshall Plan represented a different but complementary approach. Following the Second World War, classical liberal America invested heavily in the economic reconstruction of Europe, with the goal of stabilizing societies and reducing the conditions that could lead to authoritarian control. This system proved incredibly effective for many countries, as it successfully revitalized many countries while also steering many towards liberal ideology and away from extremism. However, similarly to Cold War containment, it caused significant political polarization, contributing to an us versus them mentality that further soured relationships between Western and Soviet allies. A big way to improve upon the Marshall Plan would be to supply aid through the use of non-aligned or multilateral coalitions, such as the United Nations or European Union, rather than through a global superpower. This keeps reconstruction efforts away from threats of ideological control while still ensuring a coordinated and effective, hopefully, reconstruction effort. While there is no single program equivalent to the Marshall Plan operating in Ukraine today, the scale of financial assistance, humanitarian aid, and long-term reconstruction planning reflects a similar logic.
In attempting to effectively resolve such a complex topic, it's worth looking at different political approaches. The first would be a modern liberal solution. A modern liberal solution would prioritize establishing a fair diplomatic compromise between either side as quickly as possible in order to establish post-war reconstruction, humanitarian aid, and institutional rebuilding, similar in logic to the Marshall Plan style recovery. Under a neoliberal framework, sanctions might be reduced or targeted to encourage negotiation, while reconstruction would rely heavily on private capital, international corporations, and global financial institutions. The belief is that economic interdependence increases the cost of conflict and encourages peaceful outcomes. From a collectivist perspective, the conflict could be resolved through enforced ceasefires, security guarantees, or territorial compromises, with strong state control over political and economic systems to maintain order and rebuild the Ukrainian economy in a timely manner. A hybrid solution that combines elements of the previous solutions could include negotiated ceasefires and security guarantees, continued international aid and reconstructional support, and phased economic reintegration tied to compliance with agreements.
Based on the current state of the war, it's clear that an end isn't anywhere in sight. Territorial gains are lessening, forces are becoming more dug in, and losses on both sides are still mounting. As much as I and many others would prefer to see Ukraine recapture all of its former territory, without higher amounts of sustained aid, soldiers, and a genuine miracle, it won't work out. Therefore, the only way to resolve this conflict in any form of a timely manner is to negotiate a ceasefire as borders stand. Unfortunately, these terms may still not be enough for Russian officials. Ukraine has received ceasefire deals. However, these deals include the loss of all coastal territory to the Black Sea, destroying Ukraine's economy nearly permanently as grain can be easily exported through national ports, and aid supplies can no longer be imported via sea routes to reconstruct the destroyed nation. The bloodshed needs to end, deals need to be made, but we need to understand that Ukraine as a nation needs to come out of this conflict in a state it can recover from. Therefore, either negotiations must be facilitated and enforced by multiple international actors to prevent one-sided outcomes, or the conflict needs to continue to the point where Russia submits to a Ukrainian deal.